All right, welcome back. I'm super excited to welcome our next presenter, Dr. David Hughes, or Dr. Food as he calls himself. He's a highly sought after speaker with unparalleled knowledge on global food issues and opportunities. Looking forward to this presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm particularly pleased to be talking to you, not least because you're in Canada. I'm proudly a Canadian myself. I don't sound like it, but I spent 10 plus years in Canada. My children were born there. And so I feel I'm strongly associated with Canada. But enough of that. Turbulent times, particularly in agriculture. And I think it brings substantial challenges and opportunities, not least for you guys. So let me move on. I mean, what's intrigued me if I look back over the last 2.5 years, is the number of times I've heard pundits, experts, analysts say something is unprecedented. Well, what does unprecedented mean? The definition is it's something that's never done or known before. And so I noticed that the coronavirus COVID-19 was unprecedented. Well, I guess it was as COVID-19, but as a pandemic, no. Go back 100 years, we had the Spanish flu, for goodness sake. That was a dreadful pandemic, way worse. Then let's look at March of this year. We saw food prices spike, and so I was told, at unprecedented levels. Not so. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And then, of course, there's the tragedy of the Ukraine Russian war, which is perceived to be unprecedented. No. Think back to 2014 when the Russians first invaded the Ukraine. And then let's go across to the right-hand side. We have climate change. It's unprecedented. Well, it's unprecedented to the degree that we're having climate change because of human activity. But cooling and warming of our world is far from being unprecedented. It's happened, many times in the last million years. Let me move on. And actually, I just want to sneak this one in, talking about pandemics, is that it's not just humans, and that we should be concerned about the increasing risk of livestock diseases around the world. I mean, I would suggest that the avian influenza, bird flu, is getting close to pandemic status. So on we go. Look, I'd mentioned that if we went back to March 2022, so this year, that we saw food prices peak at so-called unprecedented levels. Well, not so. If you went back to August 1973, incidentally, that's when me and Susan Hughes came to Canada. I came as a food policy analyst for the Feds, and it was at a time when food prices were at similar levels. Why? There might be people old enough in the audience to remember, but it was because the Russian and Ukrainian, wow, things just go round and round, don't they? Russian Ukrainian grain harvest failed. They didn't tell anybody because they were all under the umbrella of the USSR. And there was no satellites then giving us the information we've got now. And they popped out and bought up as much of the world's supply of grains as they could, and then announced it on one day, and food prices went through the roof. What intrigued me then was that the perception was, the general view was that we were moving to a new level of high food prices. And what happened over the next 3 decades, 30 plus years, that food prices drifted down to astonishingly low levels, driven by increases in agricultural productivity and oversupply in many respects. Is it unprecedented, the March 2022? No, it's not. But looking at climate change, I mean, just let's peek down south to the west there, to California. And I'm always intrigued. I'm sad enough to always look at the USA Drought Monitor. I was looking at just the most recent one that I can get, and it just shows you that the pervasive drought that there is in many parts of the US. So what? It's the US, for goodness sake. Well, the USA is the largest agricultural exporter in the world, after all. And then if I look across the world sea levels are rising by about 3.5 millimeters per year. I'm old-fashioned enough to go in imperial measures, so that's about a foot, 12 inches per century. Well, that's not a Western Canadian problem, is it? If the sea level is rising, it's certainly not an Alberta problem. But if you're farming near the coast, soon you may need to call in the Dutch. Let's take, they're good at it. Remember, they're good at building dikes, etc. Let's take a country like Bangladesh, where 75% of the country live at sea level. and it's got a population of 168 million. Now, what do you think they're going to do? Do you think they're just going to wait until the water goes over their heads? No, not at all. It's a huge issue for them, and they will start moving. Is that a Bangladesh problem? That's a global problem, I would suggest. And it's a reminder to me that here we are talking, this is the Global Crop Conference, but actually a full 70% of the surface of our globe is actually water. And what's more, I'm not going to talk about this because this is another talk. Water, the oceans are going to get much busier producing what? Food and energy, I would suggest. But let's get back onto the land. What sort of, again, is of concern for agronomists, for all of us who are growing food and consuming food, is the degree to which we see world soil degradation. Particularly in some major players. So, for example, look at the ones that are spiking there. China, the better part of 45% of the land that is farmed in China is degraded to a degree because of compaction, erosion, salination, acidification, overgrazing, chemical pollution, monoculture, or urbanization in their particular case. And again, Brazil, a major agricultural producer, is in trouble. I noticed that Canada and the UK, that the so-called experts suggest that 20% in both countries of the arable land is a little bit dodgy, but that's another matter. But I mentioned China, and I'm talking to you actually from the border of Wales. I'm 220 kilometers due west of London. And of a morning, if I open my door, I live in a little teeny town. If I open the door, taking Mabel, the dog, out for a walk, and if I stop and listen really carefully, then I can hear a sort of noise, which is China relentlessly hoovering the world's harvest into its storage bins. It's got the better part of half the grains of the world's in its great storage bins. And if one looks on the right on this slide, you can see the degree to which China's food imports have escalated over the last 20 years. And whatever China does has an impact on our world. Why? Because, there's 1.3 billion of them. And so if they're exporting, it tends to be in billions. And when they're importing, it tends to be in billions. And will they continue to do so? Yes. Isn't that good news for Canada? Well, I guess so, because President Xi, now lifetime President Xi, of course he's concerned about food security. So does this mean an agricultural policy in Canada should be China orientated? Well, to a degree, but are China trustworthy trade partners? I do a lot of work in Australia, and are they concerned about China? Damn right they are. Let's take Australian wine imports. They were suspended by China as trade tensions escalated. And wine sales, which 2 years ago were over $1 billion, 2 years later were 25 million, like nothing. And of course, China slapped a ban on Australia's barley exporters. I mean, again, from a Canadian point of view, say, hurrah, that gives us more opportunities. But just think about this. I was looking, like last week, Canada to send more warships through Taiwan Strait in signal to China, notwithstanding that 2 months ago, China warns Canada over planned Taiwan visit by parliamentarians. And it's a reminder to me that as a trade customer, China can both make you and break you. I'm not suggesting that we should kowtow, if you will, to China, but we have to take into account that if they're a serious trade partner, are they trustworthy? And I would put a big question mark there. And one of the intriguing things about this sort of turmoil that we've seen over the last 2.5 years, whether it be COVID, whether it be Ukraine, or whether it be climate change, is that it's caused countries around the world to be much more concerned about food security, specifically food security in their own countries. So, within the last year or so, 23 countries instituted food export restrictions, and that represented the better part of 20% of global calorie trade, for goodness sake? Why did they do it? To safeguard and to try and force prices down in their own countries where prices were going through the roof. It's a reminder that food security is much, much higher up on the lists of national agricultural policies than it ever was in the last 2 decades, I would suggest. In the UK, for example, our farming union, the National Farmers Union, is just saying we're sleepwalking in the UK into food supply crises. I mean, actually, for a range of reasons, some relating to labor, some relating to the avian influenza problem, we're importing eggs at the moment from Italy, of all places, and that major supermarkets are rationing, yes, rationing eggs over supply issues. And we're looking at our fruit and vegetables, and what's more, there is no margin in it for producers, and we're concerned that actually production is going to fall back. It's a real issue in the UK because we're only 60% self-sufficient in food, and we're not huge food exporters. We're big whiskey exporters, but that's about it. Whereas Canada, you're 70% self-sufficient, and what's more, you're the world's 5th largest food exporter. But is it all bad news about the COVID, about the Ukraine war, well, actually, that some positives have come out. I mean, thank the Lord. And for me, I'm really interested in this sort of explosion of R&D and commercial investment into agri-food supply robotics. And it's right through the supply chain. I mean, here we are in the US, Walmart unveiling drone delivery schemes for 4 million US households. I was in Slovenia recently talking, and in the hotel I was staying, I was served by a robo-waiter. In University of Cambridge here are working on a robotic chef, which can actually, and the robotic chef can actually taste. In Australia, again, where I do lots of work, Aldi, the hard discounter, which you don't have, but they do in the US, it's German-based, has a robotic pizza vending machine. Then look what John Deere is doing. This year is the first year that they've had full-scale commercial sales of self-driving tractors, those big beasts that you can see. And look at this number of startups using robotics and AI and per plant farming to transform crop cultivation. And that, I think, has all been accelerated because of the pressures we're under at the moment. That's one. This second real positive isn't necessarily positive for all the prairie provinces, because if I look across Europe, surely renewables and nuclear fusion will be having their day. Here, we're being held by the nether regions, by Russia, a la Mr. Putin, who is holding back supplies of gas and oil. What we pay for electricity, for oil and gas in Europe, bears no relationship to what you guys pay. I would suggest that households pay more than 3 times the rate that you have in Canada, particularly in the prairies. And I think that's going to change. You can see this sort of whole movement towards renewable energy. And I say that that's not necessarily great news for Alberta, for example, with its oil economy. And again, something which intrigues me and pleases me is that it's reminded us in Europe that energy comes at a cost. And many of us, 75%, have actually cut back on our use of electricity, gas at homes. So if we're cold, we put on a sweater. If we're even colder, we put on 2 sweaters. And that's happening right across Europe. You know, it's sort of brilliant, I would suggest. So just finishing on this sort of stuff, I mean, what's the most influential event in the upcoming year for you guys, for everybody, I think, and that will have an impact on agriculture globally? And for me, it's all eyes on the Ukraine. Energy prices, inflation, interest rates, economic growth, food shortages, all will depend on how the conflict plays out in the coming months. And it's not at all certain, and I'm pretty damn certain it will not be resolved in the next 12 months. So on we go. Okay, I'm supposed to be giving you a global view. Let's just a reminder that there's the better part of 8 billion people in our world. And are they sort of evenly distributed? Not at all. I mean, 6 out of 10 of the global population are in Asia, and close to 20% are in Africa. whereas, Europe, where we fancy ourselves for our clout, only 10% of total population. And we know if we go over the next 25 years or so, we're going to add another 2 billion people to our world. Where will they go? Again, will they be evenly distributed? Not at all. Actually, what's going to happen is the population size of Africa is going to double from 1 billion to 2 billion. And Asia will continue to grow, largely driven by population increases in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, and not in China, where we're probably at peak China, so to speak. And again, if we look across the world, our countries are all the same in terms of their population, their demographic profile. No, I just thought it'd be interesting. Just quickly, let's contrast Japan, which has always been a great market for Canada, in some sort of global sense. I mean, in 2020, the population of Japan was 126 million. By 2030, and we can see 2030, it will have been reduced by 6 million. So each year they lose 1 million people. Why? Because they're aging. By 2030, the median age of Japan will be 52. To contrast, in Canada, the median age in 2030 is 10 years less. Canada's aging, as is the UK, but not at the rate of Japan. And here we've got, I put the Canadian demographic profile just in small numbers. You can see the difference if you look carefully between, in Japan, there's more at the top, more older people. But contrast that with Nigeria, which is the most populated country in Africa. I mean, current population, just over 200 million. By 2030, 260 plus million. And what's the median age? 19. Now, that's either sort of great news or frightening. It's great news if you see strong economic growth in Nigeria, but it's worrisome if it fails to grow, because you'll have a lot, and not least males, who will be grumpy and wanting to cause trouble. So if you look at Nigeria, Africa in general is, of course, a clear target for Canadian, not least the arable crops that you grow, the grains and oilseeds, etc. But at the same time, it requires economic growth. So again, but let's look at the current circumstances. I couldn't find the figures for Canada, but they won't be dissimilar from the US. And it really intrigued me. If you look in the US at the polarization of income, if you will. So there are haves and have-nots. I mean, just have a look. If you take the yellow bars, for the lowest 20% of households in the US, then they spend 35% of their income on food. Whereas the top 20%, the rich people in the US, spend, close to 5%. That means the lowest 20% of US households are spending just around about $4,000 a year on food, whereas the rich 20% are spending what? $14,000. So, it's an unfair world, and that has a huge impact on what food people can afford to pay. It's very similar in Canada, and it's certainly similar in the UK. So what's this brought? This polarization of income has just accelerated during the last really turbulent 2.5 years. And it's created this sort of retail food price wars. It's a big deal in Canada, particularly spiking food prices. But actually you have less, to be perfectly honest, you've got less food retail price competition in Canada than we have in the UK. We've got about 9 major supermarkets that are competing with each other. You guys, I mean, there's 2 or 3 really big ones. But look at this. Tesco is our number 1. It's our equivalent to, let's say, your Safeway, probably plus Loblaws. It's a big player, is Tesco. And they will price match on a whole range of food products with Aldi, this sort of really low-priced hard discounter, as we call them, which is present in the US but comes from Germany. And so, for example, like this week, or within the last 6 weeks, I should say, if you look at selling pizzas for 66p, I mean that's Canadian $1 for a pizza. It's obscene, frankly. I mean, how on earth you can put a pizza in a box? You can't get a box for $1, let alone the pizza inside. So we're seeing, and who's paying the price for this? Well, of course, consumers are paying a very low price, but I would suggest producers are paying a high price, because often as not, many of the food products from the farm, the price increases that have been forced by farm input price increases are still not reflected in retail food prices. And I see this wherever I go. The other day I was talking in Fort Worth, and I was looking at fresh pork loin at like $1.99 US per pound. And just to help you out, I mean, that's Canadian, under $6 for a kg of fresh pork loin. What? Dear Lord. I was in Barcelona recently too, and I was just comparing, there were pork products versus beef products. Okay, so as you can see on the left-hand side, that's roughly the same amount of meat. One's pork, one's beef, not dissimilar cuts. And what's the difference in price? I'm saying if you are a household in Spain, which is in, say, the 40% of total households in Spain who are really income pushed at the moment, they have to take a decision. How much have I got in my purse to spend? Do I pay $4.50 for the pork, or do I pay $12 for the beef? I can see what's happening around the world, because this is spread right around the world, this movement away from red meat and more towards pork and chicken, or indeed low-priced fish. It's worrisome for me. And look, in my sort of professional career, I've sort of, apart from living in Canada, I've lived in Africa for 5 years. I lived in Kenya. And if you want to see how worrisome the current problems are associated with high food prices, let's take Kenya. Kenya is one of the most successful countries in Africa at the moment. But most Kenyans spend 50% of their total income on food. And what's happened to food prices in Kenya this year? They're up by 20%. Can you imagine the impact that has? It's just astonishing. And what's more, that leads to, whereas in Canada we might complain, well, in Kenya, what they do is they get on the streets and there's trouble. There will be violence. You can see that happening around the world. It just brings instability to our world. Okay, moving on. The power is on your plate. I want to talk a little bit about environment, the general area of sustainability and health, which is, particularly related to our industry, or was particularly, I would suggest, prior to the pandemic and to the recent turmoil. So, who's pushing the whole notion of the power is on your plate? I think it comes from all directions. One is from consumers. Two is from the public sector, whether it be national or international. Three, increasingly, it's from the food industry itself. And four, of course, it's from activists. And what's the power is on your plate? It's saying you can now influence events related to your own health and the health of the planet through the purchases that you make at the retail shelf. And let's first of all take, so who's pushing this? Let's go back a year ago now. We've just had COP27 in Egypt, but COP26 was in Glasgow, and agricultural issues were up front in COP26. And actually, we made huge promises about agriculture, essentially. I mean, 105 countries pledged to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. What I asked myself is, when we made those big promises, when actually often major political figures did so, had they talked to farmers and say, can we do this? Because I'm not sure we can. And what's more, of course, now we have the technology, and actually it's Canadian technology, which allows us to identify who is not fulfilling its promises. So satellites seek out methane leaks from pipelines, oil fields, landfills, and farms. Those are Canadian satellites, by the way. So we've put ourselves in a position where the public sector, where politicians have made big promises on behalf of the agricultural and food industry without really asking us. if I look to Europe, allow me just to talk about the EU, of course, remember, of which the UK is not part at the moment, then we've got a sort of notorious or famous Green Deal in the EU. And this was put together prior to 2019, when actually our world economically and to some degree socially and politically was in bit better shape than it is now. And the main goals, it was from farm to fork, a strategy underpinning the EU Green Deal. And actually the one item that takes the attention is that the European Union is saying by 2030, a quarter of the land will be in organic farming. There's no way it will get anywhere near close. And it's by reducing the use of chemical pesticides by half, just slamming it, and 50% reduction in sales of antibiotics for animal breeding, and 20% reduction in fertilizer use. These are big promises. And what interests me is it's starting to stumble in terms of the rate at which it's implemented. Although, can you imagine this happening in Canada? The flag is for the Netherlands. Government land grab. It says Dutch authorities offer to buy farms to fall in line with EU emission targets. They're not offering to buy. They're saying, if you farmers don't deliver on the emission targets that we have set within our policy, then we will enforceably buy your farms and we will do it ourselves or put in place managers who will take a note of the EU emission targets. Can you imagine that happening in Canada? I don't think so. Or let's move to New Zealand. We all respect New Zealand because it's a fabulous agricultural economy. But here's Jacinda Ardern, the difficult to handle Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she's got the so-called fart tax, which the farmers are saying is planning to rip the guts out of small town New Zealand farmers. And what they're saying, we're going to tax greenhouse gas emissions from farm animals. And remember that New Zealand has 26 million sheep and 6 million cows. They've only got about 5 million people, for goodness sake. I mean, again, this is heavy duty handling to try and shift the dial environmentally. In the UK, we're more laid back. We've got ELMS, which is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, being introduced, although at the moment it's on hold. And what's that about? That's about the government saying, if now we've withdrawn from the European Union, then we will make the subsidy that each farmer got, available if you deliver on public goods. That is so public money for public goods. Saying, okay, if you look after the environment, if you look after your hedges, if you plant more trees, etc., then we will pay you to do so. Actually, there's also a lump sum exit scheme where they're saying to farmers, if you want to get out now. If you can find a buyer, and we'll give you a maximum of 170 million Canadian dollars each for those who want to sell. So you can see this move towards the environment, which I think is slowing at the moment because of the pressure coming about food security. But still, again, there are activists. Here we are with the Eat Lancet Commission, and it was measuring various crops. This is so controversial, but it's so pervasive too, saying, okay, let's look at the environmental impact and the health on consumers' impact of various products. And as it happens, if I'm looking at crops, then crops, they are in the quarter, the bottom left-hand side, which is the quarter held up by the angels. It's the red meat guys that are really taking the hammer. And of course, they find that really, really unfair. But what we're moving to, certainly in Europe, is, again, this focus on health and environment. Number one is on consumer health, and it is putting in place traffic lights on all food products, from green, good, healthy, to red, bad, and healthy, on every food product. And we're already trialing it right across Europe. And what I ask when I'm talking to farmers and to food processors is look at your product and say, how would your products score? And actually, in the farm world, particularly in fruit and vegetables, and to some extent too in livestock, in meat, I think we're particularly poor at shouting about how healthy our products are. I mean, you think about it. Go to a Safeway and go into the fruit and veg department. The assumption is everybody knows how healthy those products are. We don't mention it. Would John West do that? John West, you know it. It's the canned fish people. Actually, it's owned by Thai Union from Thailand. And look, on all their tunas, it's immunity benefits, energy benefits, heart benefits. We've got to be so much better at ringing the bells about the health benefits of our products. So health traffic lights, but we're also moving towards eco scores, which is scoring food products on their environmental impact. And again, I see that it's got huge traction in the marketplace and it's coming at pace. And it's been trialed right across Europe at the moment and in other parts of the world too. There's just some examples here, again, on a traffic light basis. Green, good for the environment, and red, poor for the environment. What will be your Enviro scores? There's pictures I've got in there of potatoes, but just looking at is potato agronomy, is potato production and processing, is it good for the environment or poor? It depends on the product. And again, who's pushing this? This isn't a government thing, interesting enough. It's an industry thing with activists behind it. So in the UK, we've got new eco labels to get supermarket trials right across the board here. It's a big step forward for transparency. I mean, the interesting thing, so here's Tesco saying, okay, we want to put traffic lights showing our eco credentials, when actually the impact of most of their products is not at the supermarket level, it's all the way down the supply chain. And so they're starting to make promises about food production, i.e. you producing food at the farm level. And if you think that from, is it all too complicated from a consumer point of view to, understand eco labels and Nutri-Scores, etc., health labels? Well, they don't have to worry if they are digital natives, because of course there's an app for that, as ever. I think it's just an interesting time just to quickly put in for a second here a few things about plant-based products, which appear to be so fashionable. And actually, why do people say that they like plant-based products rather than meat-based products or dairy-based products for that matter? They say it's about their own health and it's about the environment. Actually, it tends to be more about their health than the environment. That's the principal reasons why particularly millennials and Generation Z, younger consumers are saying we're moving towards plant-based. The first thing to notice is that actually, particularly in the US, but in Canada as well, that so-called fake meat has really struggled to get traction. And the move towards plant-based is much, much stronger in the dairy industry, i.e. non-dairy dairy, than in the fake meat area. I mean, it's intriguing. And just for an example, looking at what's happened to fluid milk, liquid milk consumption on a per capita basis in the US over the last, 40 or 50 years, it's halved. Now, the view is that, that's been accelerated by people moving towards almond milk, oat milk, etc. That isn't the case. The fact that matter is that milk consumption in the US and in many countries has gone down because we've changed what we have for breakfast. We've started to cut out cereals with milk. But plant-based milks have done well and continue to do well. And it's a clear competitive threat to some aspects of dairy. That's by the by. But so what? I think it brings sort of genuine opportunities, not least for the prairie provinces. We all know that here's Roquette from France unveiling the world's largest pea protein factory. Is it in Portage la Prairie, as far as I remember? And they're looking for the Silicon Valley of plant protein. There is clear opportunity across because we're going to see growth in plant protein. And you're very capable, whether it be lentils, whether it be chickpeas, whether it be regular peas, you can grow it. And, it's part of your future. Okay, from a consumer point of view, back to, look, right now, it's a difficult time for many consumers. I know it's difficult for many farmers, but and consumers are redefining their definition of value. So pre-COVID, there was a sort of, when we had more money in our pockets, we wanted food producers to share the values that we consumers have about the land, about animal welfare, etc. But as we move into this rather difficult point at the moment, they're redefining values, saying, yes, we're still concerned about environmental and health issues, but actually we're very concerned about food prices, and we might have to make compromises. And you can see this happening in the UK. So right now, where a lot of people, a lot of households are under immense pressure, you can see that people are they're compromising their original values. They're saying, well, we want to buy high welfare red meat, but we can't quite afford it at the moment. We want to buy organic produce, but we actually want the cheapest. We'd like ethical produce, but we need to buy cheap food. And so it goes on. And what it reminds me is that you guys at the farm level, that what we see is the green bar, as in a high jump bar, the green bar is going up. And farmers say, will we get a premium for getting over the green bar? My view is, and unfortunately, you don't get a premium for getting over the green bar. You'll get discounted if you go under. And, you know, that's not necessarily fair, but it's a sort of fact of life. And again, who's pushing this move towards a higher green bar? It's not just, it's far from government. It's the industry itself. You can see these sort of voluntary commitments on sustainability. They're gaining ground, especially in Europe. That, as I said, Tesco are making huge promises about what they're going to do to carbon emissions across all the food products that they sell, when in fact, most of the carbon impact is at the farm level. So Tesco insisting on climate-friendly farming practices around the world. And when I talk to Tesco, as I do, I say, have you talked to the farmers who produce the food that you then sell, whether it be processed or in its fresh form? Because, you know, Tesco doesn't produce any food at all. It just puts it on shelves. So in the UK, all UK growers must be part of LEAF-Mark, which is a sort of environmental association, if you will, by the end of this year. And I see that right around the world. It strikes me that much of this seems to be about the soil, because isn't that where the carbon is stored? And I think that sort of underpins this sort of huge increase in fashion, if you will, but more than that. It's almost a movement, isn't it, towards regenerative agriculture, you know, regen ag, as the US says. And I see that again, PepsiCo, Nestle, McCain's, they're all talking about it. And again, when I talk to them, saying, you don't produce anything. You know, let's take PepsiCo. You sell potato products, but you don't produce them. Make sure you talk to the farmers about the promises you've made to your customers before you go public with these. And it's sort of intriguing, because we see, if I look around, it's now in the food industry, it's about the health of the land and the health of the consumer. And they've come together. Here's Birdseye. Eat peas. Why? Because they're good for the land, nitrogen fixing, of course, and they're good for you too. Or here we go in the UK with Sainsbury's, our #2 retailer. You know, let's eat the world better, 1 pea pesto pasta at a time. And the same sort of claim for kale, although who'd want to eat kale, for God's sake? It's like the soul food of the chattering classes. It's more than just about carbon. It's also about water. And here's PepsiCo making their net water positive promise, essentially. But again, it's the farmer who's going to have to make that promise on behalf of PepsiCo. And so the whole business of eating from a consumer point of view is getting more complex. There are social pressures dictating, remind me again what we can't eat. Anything with palm oil because it destroys the Amazon, fish that are unsustainably sourced, food produced with slave labor, milk from industrial-sized herds, water-intensive crops like almonds, crops that harm the bee population, etc. And for me, if I was a food producer, which I have been in history, what are the major social issues which will disturb growth in markets of the food products that you grow? Keep an eye on them. Here's Morrison's, a retailer in the UK, saying, we're ditching soy and we're going to have chickens that have been fed insects so that we don't want to be part of, it's a double whammy social benefit for them. Lower carbon footprint and no deforestation risk. Okay, almost done, so bear with me. And look, as we accelerate into the fourth agricultural revolution, it's clearly we've got to increase agricultural productivity. But as we do so, it sort of worries me because it brings about it consumer apprehension, significant activist pushback, seeking a return to traditional practices, and in many countries, concerns about, as I've mentioned, their national food security. Remember, agricultural revolution 1 was the Neolithic revolution when farming emerged, 2,000 years ago. And then there was a mechanization of agriculture starting in the 1700s. And then if we went back to the 1960s, here's Norman Borlaug, and the Green Revolution, particularly in India elsewhere. And now I think let's go back 10, 12 years, we've got Revolution 4, global revolution. It's about AI and the Internet of Things and all that, 2010 and on. It's a very exciting period. We see the emergence of vertical farms. I mean, what do you share with me? If I look at the market valuations of some of these vertical farming companies, they seem to defy economic gravity. As you see the emergence of agribusiness unicorns, these worth over $1 billion, particularly in the US. They're also in the UK, and of course in Canada. I notice McCain and Goodleaf in Quebec at the moment. I mean, putting serious money in, like $150 million for Christ's sake. And is it? But you can say from a grain point of view, well, that's got nothing to do with vertical farming. Well, Infarm, again, a Dutch investment company, Vertical Farm projects 117 tons per hectare yield for indoor grown wheat. Is that sort of pie in the sky? Likely, but it's sort of intriguing. You can see again this movement. I don't think it's going to do anything in the short term, but it's we've got to look. I think everybody has to say, what will it look like in 30 years' time? And then, of course, there is what about genetic modification, which is so scary for many consumers. But I'm just an example here. Japan launching the world's first genome-edited tomato. CRISPR technology, for example, which clearly is going to have an impact right across the board in every crop area, I would suggest, over the next 5-10 years. Here, CRISPR technology for strawberries, something I do a lot with. So, but gene manipulation makes many consumers nervous. We've got to ensure that the benefit is relevant and significant for consumers and well communicated to them. So, everything I see is that, UK citizens, but they could be Canadian citizens, are saying, hang on, we want clear labels on food products. We want safety testing on anything that's been GM'd, even if it's CRISPR, even if it's just gene editing. We want traceability in the farming and food sector. 85% in the UK want gene-edited crops and foods regulated and labeled. So this is my sort of statement. Look, my comic on a Saturday is The Economist, and this is 2 years ago now. The Economist had a whole section, big section on and the need for a new productivity revolution to feed the world by 2050. And I wrote back to The Economist, which they published, and said, look, the new productivity revolution in agriculture has already started. It's driven by clever manipulation of crop biomes, gene editing, CRISPR technology, precision agriculture with big data, and the emergence of new protein sources such as plant-based foods, insects, cultured meats, etc. However, intriguingly, this revolution is happening in tandem with rejuvenated agricultural practices characteristic of previous centuries, which include composting, minimal tillage, integrating livestock and cropping, improving crop diversity and crop rotation. This is good news for farmers, consumers, and our planet. And just as I exit here, look, the good thing from a farmer perspective is wherever I look at survey information, this is for Europe, if I look at who do consumers trust in the food supply chain, they tend to trust farmers more than any other. So here we are in Europe, that farmers lead the way in trust, whereas big food manufacturers and actually authorities, which tend to be governments, which sometimes is unfortunate because it's unfair, at least trust. So, you're sitting pretty. Remind people that who produces the food. It's not retailers, it's you guys. And I wish you well. And this is to end here. Look, over the last 2.5 years, I mean, in my professional life, much of it in the last 20 years has been spent just wandering around the world, talking, yakking away like I'm doing at the moment. And I've had I haven't been comfortable over the last 2 years, where I was just sat at home with the long-suffering Susan Hughes. And whenever I felt grumpy, and I did often, I'd flick this up. It's one of the food photographs of the year, which is the Pink Lady competition, which is published each year. And it was of a couple in Bangladesh, Dhaka, sitting on their cart on the top of a garbage heap outside the major city, having their lunch. And it was just a reminder to me that if you think you've got a bad time, David, look around the world. We've got 8 billion people in our world. The better part of 800 million wake up hungry and go to bed hungry. And that's not just their problem, it's a world problem, and we have to solve it, and you're part of the solution. Thanks very much, and I look forward. I hope there's lots of questions, and talk to you soon.
Let's get started. So thank you, David, very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Definitely appreciate the excitement, enthusiasm. I know sometimes on online meetings and presentations, it's tough to just sit there and have the excitement and enthusiasm when you're talking to yourself in your office, kind of thing. So I really appreciate that. We'll get started with questions. I have a feeling that everybody's got questions. So did somebody want to go first? Claudette, you had mentioned earlier.
I guess there's a lot of information in there that I hadn't heard before, but the issue itself, to me, feels like something that we've been struggling with for quite a while. And I would like a silver bullet for getting the resistance started.
Right, Claudette. You shoot yours first and then see if I can respond.
Well, it seems to me that, I mean, I'm part of Farming Smarter. So we in the past have had various different speakers at conferences that talk about how people trust farmers and we need to be speaking to them. But as individuals, it's very difficult to get heard.
Yeah.
And the collectives are few and far between and siloed. So the voice becomes very diffuse.
Right. When you mean siloed, you mean it's the like an grain association or the
yeah. And so or beef or whatever, right? And like you say, a lot of stuff coming from the people who don't actually produce food but sell it. And in some respects, an organization like ours that might be able to take on some of that role doesn't get the funding that some of us does when they want to go and do an agriculture is bad for bees campaign.
Right. Although so TikTok helps.
TikTok?
Yeah, TikTok helps, doesn't it? That increasingly social media, if you've got an organization with some social media capacity, which doesn't mean lots of resources, then you can get an extraordinary amount of interest, particularly with the group that you want to connect with, I think, which is younger consumers, because they're the ones who can be influenced and are, I think, generally ready and willing to learn a little more about it. But look, this, as you said, it's a big question. There's no silver bullet. I think it's particularly challenging in Western Canada because unlike Europe, in the UK, we live in our countryside. You sort of pass farms every day, and it's within 40 kilometers, you're into farmland. And as if I think of the US, Australia, and Canada, where you have big blocks of lands with relatively large scale farms that people don't interact on a regular basis. In the UK, for example, we have Open Farm Sunday, and where people come out of the towns and visit farms. And it takes a bit of organization, but it's hugely successful and very influential. There's one of the most successful TV programs that links to farming is, I've just forgotten the name of the guy now. He's a motorhead who has a whole series, which is now into series 2, and it's going on to series 3, which is working on a farm. And it gets like top viewership. But no, it's not easy. But what I'm saying is, back to my social media story, that actually it's relatively easy if you've got something that resonates with what consumers want to know about food and where it's produced, that you don't need big resources. And what is quite clear is that increasingly people want to know where their food comes from. And they want to relate, they hope that the people who are producing their food share the same values as they do. And I think that's the trick from a farm point of view, is saying, you know, we don't know you, but we know what you value, and we're consonant with your own values.
David, if I may, it's George here. Your last statement you made of your presentation, I think, is probably the most important one, and especially coming from my background. I've been working in on a voluntary basis on the area of food relief and feeding people for years and years and years. And you made the statement that 800 million plus people go to bed hungry, wake up hungry. Yet everything else you had in your presentation was probably from the 200 million or 300 million that can afford to pay for their food. That's and it's right. That other 3 billion people in between that aren't even mentioned and unfortunately aren't. And unfortunately, that's the way a capitalistic system works. The people with the money, get to make the rules. It's a good old golden rule, right? So you get all these demands coming on production of food. We heard from a farmer in the Netherlands earlier today, one from Ireland, one from Ukraine, completely dramatically different viewpoints. And I guess that's my concern is, okay, we are reacting to probably 20% of the world's population when it comes to many of these things you've listed. Some of them are valid, don't get me wrong, but there's another 60% or more of the world that has no voice, let alone the 20% that go to bed hungry every day and wake up hungry every morning. So I guess, where does that fit in this whole future of what's happening to food?
Well, I mean, clearly it's a big issue. And it's just unconscionable that there should be 800 million people who wake up and go to bed hungry. And that isn't a specifically, let's say, an African or a Bangladesh problem. That's a world problem. And so, and we have to sort of understand that is the case. I mean, I can't make it better quickly. In fact, I can make it worse quickly, because if I look at what's happened over the last 5-6 decades, then agricultural productivity in what we refer to as emerging countries has declined. Actually, it's also declined, worrisomely, in what we call developed countries. And if you look at the emerging world, why has it declined? Because there is increasingly less public sector funding of agricultural research and development and extension in countries. So take Africa. I mean, I lived and worked in Africa for 5 years. I'm very well aware of the reality of being a smallholder producer in any of the African countries, and they're peasant farmers. But they're not stupid farmers. They're just resource poor farmers. What is slightly encouraging is, let's move to, say, West Africa. And if you look at what's been happening more recently in cocoa, if you take Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, the West African bunch of countries there, which are the major cocoa producers of this world. Well, the Nestle's of this world increasingly are aware that if those small-scale farmers don't make a living, then they won't have a product to sell. And within the last 2 or 3 years, Nestle, and this isn't a promotion for Nestle, but they're now putting up a promise of many millions, I mean, $1 billion of investment in West Africa to try and improve productivity in West Africa for cocoa, so they have a cocoa product which they can convert into chocolate and sell. But it's very sticky. I think it's really problematic that governments, including international governments, as in the World Bank, have backed off public sector finance of agriculture and R&D. And that's a major problem. If we went back to the 1960s, which I refer to as the third global agricultural revolution, the Norman Borlaug days, there was substantial investment by the public sector, international public sector, as indeed there was by the private sector. What is worrisome for me, if I look at what I refer to as the fourth agricultural revolution, so from 2010 on, this huge increase in venture capital investment in agribusiness, particularly at the farm level, that it is largely private sector, and that I'm not against, but what it suggests to me is that those that can afford the technology that's being developed will be the larger scale farmers, and it will increasingly polarize what we see in global agriculture between the little guys and the big guys, and there'll be a big gap in the middle. So yeah, it's a great, huge problem, economic and social problem, and it has to be addressed internationally.
All right, we should have time for one more quick question if somebody has a burning question to ask.
I hope so. I've come a long way, Jamie.
Oh.
Okay.
Dave, nobody's going to take it. I will. Thanks so much for coming. David, I've seen you speak like 4 times now, and it's always exciting. I've never really understood how somebody could get so excited about policy, but it is starting to grow on me. And I think one of the things I've learned in my recent Nuffield travels as well is that ag policy they're being created by non-ag people without proper ag resources. So if the governments don't have the connection to agriculture, first of all, why are they making policy at all without consultation? And how can we improve sort of the voice for agriculture in policy development?
Phew. Yeah, I mean, boy, oh boy, that's all I need at the end of my day here is these sort of heavy duty questions. I tell you, and also, I mean, often I'm skeptical about agricultural policy, whoever implements it, even if they have a strong agricultural background, because it will bend according to the ways of politics. So look, I'm not answering a question, but I think I might have addressed it in my talk when I say, well, if I see what's happening in the UK, we had ELMS, so the Environmental Land Management Scheme. You can see a huge research gone into it and quite good interaction with farming, etc. And largely the farming sector have been sort of on side with it. But then, as ever with politics, what makes a change? Events like COVID-19, events like the Ukraine war, events like the cost of living crisis, and then everything gets pushed to the side because there are other more extreme political requirements. And so across Europe, for example, you can see this, what was a real move towards trying to bring more environmental issues into agriculture. And actually, they're being pushed aside because of concerns that they might increase further food prices. And so politically, so what's my point here? That from a farmer point of view, actually what farmers want is they want clear guidelines on policies that preferably they support, and then that gives them time to respond to them in businesses which are intrinsically long-term. And that tends not to happen. And I can see that happening now, that farmers are being asked to take decisions right now in the UK and in Europe without knowing exactly how policy will turn out in the next 18 months. And from a business point of view, that's just, it's horrible to have to put your hands around that.
All right. Well, I hate to cut it off, but we do want to respect the time. So we do have our next presenter ready to go. Farming Smarter obviously wants to recognize some of our partners. So Metos and FMC are a couple this year. Our next presenter is Dr. Eric Prosco from Georgia, and we're going to join with him live. So we will meet you in the next session right away. Thank you so much, David, for your time.
Yeah, and can I say thanks very much for anybody who listened, and I wish I could have been in Lethbridge or indeed in Canada, but my time will come. Thanks very much again, and night for me. Can I have a glass of red wine now, thank the Lord.
Yes, enjoy your wine. You've earned it. Thanks so much.
Have a good night, David.
Night.
Bye.
Thanks very much, Sean, too. Thank you. Bye-bye.